November 22nd, 1963. 12:30 p.m. 3 shots echo through Dealey Plaza. President John F. Kennedy slumps forward in his limousine, fatally wounded. Within hours, a suspect is arrested. Within days, he's murdered on live television. The case is closed. Except it was never really closed because nothing about what happened in Dallas that day makes any sense. The official story is simple. A lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. He killed the president and wounded Texas Governor John Connally. Case closed. But the evidence tells a different story. A story of impossible bullet trajectories, of witnesses who heard shots from multiple directions, of evidence that disappeared, of people who died under suspicious circumstances, of investigations that were shut down before they could find the truth. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is a conspiracy, documented, proven, admitted to by government officials decades later. The only question that remains is, who really killed John F. Kennedy? Let's start with what we know for certain. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy's motorcade was scheduled to travel through downtown Dallas on its way to the Trade Mart, where the president was to deliver a speech. The route was published in newspapers days in advance. Anyone in Dallas knew exactly where the president would be and when. The motorcade route included a slow turn from Houston Street onto Elm Street, directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository building. The turn required the limousine to slow to approximately 11 miles per hour. This created what security experts call a fatal funnel, a slow-moving target, an unprotected exposure, a sniper's dream. The Secret Service knew this. They had reviewed the route. They had noted the high windows overlooking the plaza. They had identified the grassy knoll area with its trees and fences that could conceal a shooter. Standard protocol would have required agents to secure these areas, to position counter-snipers, to potentially alter the route. None of that happened. At 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade made the slow turn onto Elm Street, shots rang out. Here's where the official story begins to fall apart. According to the Warren Commission, the investigation body established to examine the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor window of the book depository. The first shot missed completely. The second shot hit President Kennedy in the back and then struck Governor Connally, who was seated in front of Kennedy in a jump seat. The third shot hit Kennedy in the head, killing him instantly. This is the famous single bullet theory. 1 bullet causing 7 wounds in 2 men. Entry and exit wounds in Kennedy's back and throat. Entry and exit wounds in Connally's back and chest. A shattered wrist. A wound in Connally's thigh. 7 wounds. 1 bullet. The bullet was later recovered on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. It was in nearly pristine condition, barely deformed, despite allegedly passing through 2 bodies, shattering bone, and causing catastrophic damage. Doctors, forensic experts, and ballistic specialists have called this impossible. A bullet traveling through human bodies and bone would fragment, deform, and lose significant mass. The recovered bullet showed none of these characteristics. But there's a bigger problem with the single bullet theory. The angles don't work. President Kennedy was sitting in the back seat of the limousine. Governor Connally was sitting in a jump seat in front of him, slightly to the left and lower. For a single bullet fired from above and behind to hit Kennedy in the back, exit his throat, then hit Connally in the back, the bullet would need to change direction in mid-air. The Warren Commission tried to explain this by claiming Connally was turned in his seat at the moment of impact. But the Zapruder film, the famous home movie footage taken by witness Abraham Zapruder, doesn't show Connally turning. He's facing forward when he's hit. Multiple trajectory analyses, including computer simulations conducted decades later, have concluded that the single bullet theory is physically impossible given the positions of Kennedy and Connally in the limousine. So if one bullet didn't cause 7 wounds, how many bullets were there? And where did they come from? This is where witness testimony becomes critical and problematic for the official story. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, dozens of witnesses in Dealey Plaza were interviewed by police and FBI agents. Their accounts were remarkably consistent on one point. Many of them heard shots coming from multiple directions. At least 40 witnesses reported hearing shots from the area of the grassy knoll, a raised embankment to the right and in front of the presidential limousine. Some witnesses said they heard shots from both the book depository behind the motorcade and the grassy knoll in front of it. Several witnesses ran toward the grassy knoll immediately after the shooting, believing that's where at least one shooter had been positioned. Police officers were photographed searching the area behind the wooden fence at the top of the grassy knoll within minutes of the assassination. One witness, railroad worker S.M. Holland, was standing on the railroad overpass directly above the grassy knoll area. He later testified that he saw smoke coming from behind the wooden fence and heard shots from that location. He ran to the area immediately and found fresh footprints in the mud and cigarette butts, suggesting someone had been standing there recently. The Warren Commission dismissed these witnesses. They concluded that the sounds had echoed off buildings, confusing witnesses about the direction of the shots. But acoustic experts who later analyzed the evidence disagreed. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations commissioned a scientific acoustic analysis of a police dictabelt recording that had captured the sounds of the shooting. The analysis concluded with 95% certainty that at least 4 shots had been fired and that one shot came from the grassy knoll area. This was a bombshell. The official government investigation 15 years after the Warren Commission had concluded that there had been a conspiracy, that Lee Harvey Oswald had not acted alone, that there had been at least one additional shooter. But by 1978, most of the key witnesses were dead. Let's talk about the witnesses who didn't survive. In the 3 years following the Kennedy assassination, 18 material witnesses died, 6 by gunfire, 3 in motor vehicle accidents, 2 by suicide, 1 from a cutthroat, 1 from a karate chop to the neck, 3 from heart attacks, 2 from natural causes. An actuary hired by the London Sunday Times calculated the odds of this many material witnesses dying within 3 years of the event. The odds were 1 in 100,000 trillion. Let's look at a few specific cases. Dorothy Kilgallen was a prominent journalist and television personality. In 1964, she interviewed Jack Ruby in jail and claimed she was about to break the Kennedy assassination case wide open. She told friends she had information that would blow the investigation apart. On November 8, 1965, she was found dead in her Manhattan apartment. Official cause of death: accidental overdose of alcohol and barbiturates. Her notes on the Ruby interview were never found. Rose Cherami was found unconscious on a Louisiana highway on November 20, 1963, 2 days before the assassination. She told police and hospital staff that President Kennedy was going to be killed in Dallas. After the assassination, police investigated her claims. Cherami said she had been traveling with 2 men who were involved in the plot. On September 4, 1965, Cherami was struck and killed by a car on a Texas highway. The driver was never identified. Lee Bowers was a railroad tower operator who had an elevated view of the parking lot behind the grassy knoll on the day of the assassination. He testified that he saw 2 men standing behind the fence in the minutes before the shooting, and that one of them appeared to be holding something. He also reported seeing a flash of light or smoke from that area during the shooting. On August 9, 1966, Bowers died in a single-car accident in Texas. Witnesses said his car drifted off the road and hit a bridge abutment. Bowers was an experienced driver on a road he traveled frequently. No autopsy was performed. David Ferry was a private investigator and pilot with connections to anti-Castro Cuban groups and the CIA. He knew Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. In February 1967, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison was preparing to arrest Ferry as part of his investigation into the assassination. On February 22nd, before the arrest could happen, Ferry was found dead in his apartment. Official cause of death: natural causes, a berry aneurysm. But the circumstances were suspicious. Ferry had left 2 suicide notes, but the coroner ruled his death natural. These are just 4 examples. There are dozens more: witnesses who saw too much, investigators who asked too many questions, associates of Oswald or Ruby who knew too much, all dead within a few years of the assassination, most under circumstances that raised serious questions. The pattern is undeniable. People who could have provided evidence that contradicted the official story kept dying. But let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about Lee Harvey Oswald. Who was he really, and could he have been the shooter? Oswald's biography reads like a spy novel. Born in New Orleans in 1939, he joined the Marines at 17. He was stationed at a U.S. military base in Japan that conducted highly classified U-2 spy plane operations. Despite having only a 9th grade education, Oswald taught himself Russian and showed unusual interest in Soviet communism. In 1959, at age 20, Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. He renounced his American citizenship and announced he wanted to become a Soviet citizen. He told Soviet officials he would provide them with classified information from his time in the Marines. This should have been a massive counterintelligence problem for the United States. A former Marine with access to classified information had defected to America's primary enemy during the height of the Cold War. The standard response would be a thorough investigation, potential prosecution for treason, and permanent placement on watch lists. Instead, Oswald's defection was barely noted by U.S. intelligence agencies. He lived in the Soviet Union for 2.5 years, married a Russian woman, and had a child. Then, in 1962, he simply came back. He wrote to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow saying he wanted to return to America, and the U.S. government welcomed him back. No prosecution, no lengthy interrogation. The State Department even lent him money for travel expenses. This is extraordinary. Defectors were not allowed to simply return, especially not during the Cold War. The fact that Oswald was permitted to come back suggests he was working for someone. American intelligence? Soviet intelligence? Both? After returning to the United States, Oswald moved to Dallas. He got a job. He became involved with pro-Castro Cuban groups. He was photographed handing out pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans. He appeared on a local radio program defending Castro and communism. But there were contradictions. Oswald also had connections to anti-Castro Cuban exile groups, the people who hated Castro. FBI and CIA files declassified decades later show that Oswald was in contact with intelligence officers and was known to multiple federal agencies before the assassination. In September 1963, 2 months before the assassination, Oswald allegedly traveled to Mexico City and visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies. He applied for a visa to travel to Cuba. The CIA had both embassies under heavy surveillance, with cameras and listening devices capturing everyone who entered. Photographs and audio recordings should have documented Oswald's visits, but when investigators later requested this evidence, the CIA said it didn't exist. The cameras hadn't been working that day. The audio tapes had been routinely destroyed. The one photograph they did have of someone leaving the Soviet embassy on the day Oswald was supposedly there showed a completely different man. Not Oswald. Either the CIA's surveillance of Soviet and Cuban facilities in Mexico City, one of the most important intelligence targets in the Western Hemisphere, failed at the exact moment Lee Harvey Oswald visited, or someone is lying about Oswald being there. On November 22, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was working at the Texas School Book Depository. At 12:30 p.m., shots were fired. 90 minutes later, Oswald was arrested in a movie theater after allegedly shooting and killing Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit. The evidence against Oswald for Kennedy's murder was circumstantial. A rifle found on the 6th floor of the book depository was traced to an alias Oswald had used. Witnesses placed Oswald in the building at the time of the shooting. He had fled the building shortly after the assassination. But there were problems. The rifle found at the scene was a cheap Italian surplus weapon, a Mannlicher Carcano. It was not the weapon of choice for any professional shooter. It had a misaligned scope. Testing showed it was inaccurate and difficult to fire rapidly. The official story claimed Oswald fired 3 shots in approximately 6 seconds. Expert marksmen later tried to duplicate this feat using the same model rifle. Most couldn't do it. Those who couldn't achieve the accuracy necessary to hit a moving target from 60 feet above and behind. Paraffin tests performed on Oswald after his arrest showed gunpowder residue on his hands but not on his cheeks. If he had fired a rifle, there should have been residue on his face from the rifle's blowback. The absence of residue on his cheeks suggested he hadn't fired a rifle that day. When arrested, Oswald repeatedly stated he was a patsy. He claimed he hadn't shot anyone. He asked for legal representation. He seemed genuinely confused about why he was being accused. For 2 days, Oswald was interrogated by Dallas police, FBI agents, and Secret Service. Remarkably, no recordings were made of these interrogations. No court reporter was present. No detailed notes survive. We have no reliable record of what Oswald actually said during those crucial hours. On November 24th, 2 days after the assassination, police were transferring Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. The transfer was scheduled for 10 a.m. but was delayed. When Oswald was finally brought down to the basement parking garage, a crowd of reporters and photographers was waiting. The event was being broadcast live on national television. As Oswald walked past the cameras, a man lunged forward and fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen. Oswald collapsed. The shooter was immediately subdued by police. It was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with connections to organized crime. Oswald died 2 hours later at Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. The only person who definitively knew whether Lee Harvey Oswald killed John F. Kennedy was now dead. He would never stand trial. He would never testify. The truth died with him. Or did it? Let's talk about Jack Ruby. The official story is that Ruby was so overcome with grief and rage over Kennedy's death that he spontaneously decided to kill Oswald. He happened to be in the area, he saw an opportunity, and he acted on impulse to spare Jackie Kennedy the trauma of a trial. But the evidence tells a different story. Jack Ruby was not a grieving citizen. He was a nightclub owner with deep ties to organized crime. FBI files show Ruby had connections to major Mafia figures in Dallas, Chicago, and New Orleans. He had been running guns to Cuba in the 1950s. He was an FBI informant. He knew both pro-Castro and anti-Castro Cuban groups. Ruby had visited Cuba multiple times in the late 1950s. One associate later testified that Ruby had been involved in smuggling operations. Another claimed Ruby had connections to Santo Traficante, the Mafia boss who controlled gambling operations in Cuba before Castro took over, and who had every reason to want Kennedy dead. In the days before Kennedy's assassination, Ruby's behavior was unusual. He made multiple phone calls to organized crime figures across the country. He visited newspaper offices and the Dallas Police Department at unusual hours. On the night before Oswald's transfer, Ruby was seen at the police station around midnight, long after normal visiting hours. On the morning of November 24th, Ruby was at Western Union sending a money order at approximately 11:17 a.m. The police transfer of Oswald was originally scheduled for 10 a.m., but had been delayed. Ruby arrived at the police basement at approximately 11:21 a.m., just 4 minutes before Oswald was brought out. He claimed he had entered through an unlocked door, but security was supposed to be tight. The basement had been secured. Only authorized personnel were allowed in. How did Ruby, a known nightclub owner with no police credentials, gain access at the exact moment Oswald was being transferred? Some researchers believe Ruby had inside help, that he knew the transfer had been delayed, that he was admitted to the basement deliberately so he could silence Oswald. After shooting Oswald, Ruby was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. But he never served the sentence. While awaiting a new trial, Ruby developed aggressive lung cancer and died in jail on January 3rd, 1967. But before he died, Ruby made several statements suggesting he knew more than he had told. In 1965, Ruby met with the Warren Commission. He begged them to take him to Washington for questioning, saying he couldn't tell the truth in Dallas because his life was in danger. He said there was a conspiracy and that he was being used as a scapegoat. The Warren Commission refused his request. In 1967, As Ruby lay dying of cancer, he told psychiatrists and journalists that he had been part of a conspiracy. He said Oswald had been set up as a patsy. He said powerful people had orchestrated the assassination. He said he couldn't reveal the full truth because it would endanger his family. Then he died, taking whatever he knew to the grave. So if Oswald didn't act alone, or if he was indeed a patsy, who killed Kennedy and why? Multiple groups had motive and opportunity. The Mafia. Kennedy's brother Robert, as Attorney General, had launched an unprecedented war on organized crime. Prosecutions of mob figures had increased dramatically. Mafia bosses like Carlos Marcello in New Orleans and Santo Traficante in Florida faced deportation or prison. The Mafia had the resources, the connections, and the ruthlessness to orchestrate the assassination. Anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Kennedy had authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, then refused to provide air support, causing the invasion to fail. Cuban exiles felt betrayed. Many had worked with the CIA and had access to weapons and training. They had motive and capability. The CIA. This is the most explosive possibility. Kennedy had clashed repeatedly with CIA leadership. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, he had fired CIA Director Allen Dulles and vowed to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Kennedy had also begun questioning U.S. involvement in Vietnam and had signed orders to withdraw American advisors. Elements within the CIA and military intelligence who wanted to escalate the Vietnam War may have seen Kennedy as an obstacle. Elements within the U.S. government itself. Kennedy had made powerful enemies. His civil rights agenda angered Southern politicians. His nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union angered hardline anti-communists. His plans to reform tax policy and reduce the oil depletion allowance angered wealthy businessmen. Vice President Lyndon Johnson had his own motivations. He was facing multiple scandals and potential removal from the 1964 ticket. With Kennedy dead, Johnson became president. The truth is probably a combination of these factors, not a single conspiracy, but a convergence of interests. Multiple groups who wanted Kennedy dead, who had the resources to make it happen, and who had connections to each other through the intelligence community, organized crime, and anti-Castro operations. The evidence points to a sophisticated operation. Multiple shooters, false identities, evidence manipulation, witness intimidation, all hallmarks of an intelligence operation. And then there's the cover-up. The Warren Commission was established 1 week after the assassination. President Johnson personally selected the members, including former CIA Director Allen Dulles, the man Kennedy had fired. The commission's mandate was clear: find the truth. But the commission operated under intense pressure to reach a quick conclusion that would reassure the American public. After 10 months of investigation, the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy. Case closed. But the commission's investigation was deeply flawed. Key evidence was ignored or suppressed. Witnesses who contradicted the lone gunman theory were not called to testify. The commission relied heavily on FBI and CIA reports, despite the fact that both agencies had potential conflicts of interest. Many commission members later admitted they had doubts about the conclusions but felt pressure to reach consensus. In 1976, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the investigation. After 2 years of work, they reached a stunning conclusion. President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. The committee found evidence of at least 4 shots and at least 1 additional shooter. They couldn't determine who was responsible, but they confirmed the Warren Commission had been wrong. But by then, most of the evidence was gone. Files had been destroyed, photographs had disappeared, key witnesses were dead. The trail had gone cold, and then there are the files that still remain classified. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Records Act, requiring all assassination-related documents to be released by October 26, 2017, 54 years after the assassination. The deadline came. Most documents were released, but several thousand files remained classified. Presidents Trump and Biden both postponed full release, citing national security concerns. Why? What could possibly remain so sensitive that it must be kept secret more than 60 years after the event? Everyone involved is dead. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union no longer exists. What is still being protected? The most likely answer is not protecting sources and methods, it's protecting institutions. The files probably reveal the extent of CIA and FBI knowledge of Oswald before the assassination. They probably show intelligence agency connections to the anti-Castro Cuban groups and Mafia figures who had motive to kill Kennedy. They probably document how badly the investigation was mishandled and how much evidence was deliberately suppressed. Releasing those files wouldn't endanger national security, but it would force a reckoning with how thoroughly the American public was lied to for over half a century. 3 people went to Dealey Plaza that day, knowing what was going to happen. One of them was Lee Harvey Oswald, if he was actually the shooter. One of them may have been firing from the grassy knoll. One of them was coordinating the operation. All 3 are almost certainly dead now. The shooters, the planners, the people who gave the orders, all gone. What remains is the evidence, buried in classified files, hidden in archives, scattered across decades of investigations that were never allowed to reach their conclusions. President Kennedy was killed in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses in an American city. His murder should have been solvable. Instead, it became the most infamous cold case in American history. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because powerful people decided the truth was too dangerous to reveal. The files remain sealed. The investigation remains incomplete. The truth remains classified. And every year that passes, fewer people remember a time when Americans believed their government told them the truth. That may be the real legacy of Dallas. Not just a murdered president, but a murdered trust. The moment America stopped believing the official story. The moment conspiracy stopped being a theory and became a documented fact. November 22, 1963, Dealey Plaza. 3 shots. 1 president dead. 1 suspect murdered on live television before he could talk. 60 years later, we still don't know who really killed John F. Kennedy, but we know for certain we've never been told the truth.